Late August, 1944, the hedgerows of Normandy had finally been crushed beneath tanks and rolling artillery barrages. Allied armies were flooding east across France in a surge that German staffs were struggling to slow. Along the roads leading toward the Seine, prisoners repeated the same warning in interrogation tents and requisitioned farmhouses. They talked about American guns that never seemed to fall silent, about armored columns that appeared before defensive lines had time to solidify, about attacks that kept coming even after German commanders thought they had stabilized the front. Inside German headquarters, intelligence officers circled the same name in grease pencil across map overlays and intercepted reports. Lawton Collins, commander of the United States 7th Corps, the man whose formations had ripped open the front during Operation Cobra. Signal summaries described his units as unusually dangerous, unusually fast. Several German officers privately referred to him as the most methodical American commander now loose in France. And then, in that same week, while those assessments were still circulating inside Wehrmacht intelligence channels, Collins received a directive from his own headquarters. The advance was being reorganized. Boundaries were shifting. New axes of attack were being plotted. His corps was quietly moved off the main spearhead he had helped create. Other commanders would carry the primary thrust eastward. Berlin feared him. Allied headquarters had just pulled him back. There was no public announcement, no photographers, no headlines, only typed orders, subdued staff briefings, and fresh arrows drawn across wall maps in canvas command trailers. To German intelligence, Collins looked like a growing threat. To higher Allied planners wrestling with fuel shortages, traffic jams, and coalition coordination, he was one element in a front that stretched hundreds of miles and could not be allowed to fracture. The timing unsettled officers who had watched his corps fight its way out of Normandy. Collins absorbed the news without visible protest, but the contrast lingered. Enemy staffs were ranking him among the Americans they most dreaded facing. His own command chain was reshuffling responsibilities at the height of momentum. It was the sort of contradiction that only made sense later, once historians began reconstructing the campaign with charts and hindsight. In the late summer of 1944, it simply raised questions. Lawton Collins did not resemble the kind of general who usually attracted dramatic attention. He was compact in stature, precise in movement, with a restrained manner that set him apart from the thunderous reputations of figures like George Patton or Bernard Montgomery. Born in 1900 in New Orleans to an army family that valued steady professionalism over theatrics, he grew up surrounded by duty rather than spectacle. He graduated from West Point respectably, but without the class ranking or flamboyant personality that produced instant legends. There were no cultivated press contacts, no carefully managed public persona. In the small, insular interwar army, Collins followed the slow grind of staff colleges, artillery posts, and rotational assignments that rewarded patience far more than celebrity. Gunnery became his language. Tables of fire, timing calculations, the choreography between guns, infantry, and armor that turned plans on paper into movement across ground. Officers noticed, reporters did not. Collins built a reputation for mastering complexity and keeping operations coherent when friction threatened to tear them apart. He avoided political maneuvering, never chased publicity, and showed little interest in cultivating the kind of image that accelerated careers in Washington or London. When the United States entered the war, that habit followed him overseas. While Patton dominated headlines in North Africa and Montgomery posed confidently before cameras, Collins spent his days buried in map cases and firing schedules, sitting through planning sessions that lasted long after midnight, refining coordination drills until subordinate commanders could execute them under fire. To some at higher headquarters, he seemed competent in an almost invisible way. To the men under him, he was something else entirely. He listened. He demanded clarity. He insisted that every assault be synchronized down to the minute and supported by overwhelming firepower. Confusion irritated him more than enemy resistance. As American forces pushed deeper into combat, that quiet professionalism hardened into something sharper. In North Africa, and then during preparations for the cross-channel invasion, Collins proved adept at turning complicated coalition plans into orders units could actually follow in the field. He understood how engineers cleared paths, how artillery softened defenses, how armor exploited gaps, and how infantry held ground once it had been taken. By the time he assumed command of 7th Corps in England, senior planners viewed him as a technician of modern warfare, a commander trusted with managing thousands of men across terrain that could swallow careless formations whole. The press barely noticed. German intelligence did. On D-Day, and in the brutal weeks that followed, Collins's corps fought through some of the ugliest terrain in Western Europe. Normandy's hedgerow country turned 20th century armies into something closer to siege forces, with tanks creeping down sunken lanes while infantry clawed forward through earthen walls at grenade distance. Fields became traps. Villages changed hands twice before noon. Every 100 yards had to be bought with explosives, smoke, and blood. Collins spent those weeks moving constantly between command posts, listening to battalion and regimental commanders describe orchards that had become killing zones and crossroads where German machine guns pinned entire companies in place. He pushed for adaptation, urging engineers to blast passages through embankments, demanding tighter coordination between armor and rifle units, refining rolling artillery schedules designed to smother defenders long enough for assaults to close. When Operation Cobra detonated west of Saint-Lô in late July, it was 7th Corps that punched directly into the rupture, widening the corridor until American armored divisions poured through into open country. German resistance in his sector collapsed faster than planners had predicted. Prisoners spoke of shell fire that never lifted and attacks that arrived before defensive lines could be reset. Reconnaissance reports described columns retreating without orders, gun positions abandoned in haste, supply dumps burning along the roads. At Allied headquarters, staff officers began assigning Collins the hardest sectors of the front, the places where breakthroughs mattered most. The same phrases appeared again and again in interrogation summaries and after-action reports. 7th Corps advanced with unsettling coherence. Its artillery fires were dense and precisely timed. Its armored thrusts stayed welded to infantry screens. Engineers cleared routes before resistance could reform. To German commanders scanning maps and trying to predict where the next hammer blow would fall, Collins' formations became a pattern they could not ignore. It was exactly at that moment when battlefield credibility was compounding and enemy intelligence was taking notice that friction inside the Allied command structure sharpened. Omar Bradley, now overseeing the expanding American armies in France, represented a different tier of responsibility. He worried about fuel pipelines that lagged behind racing spearheads, about clogged ports, about British and American formations advancing at different tempos along a front that stretched for hundreds of miles. Bradley thought in terms of balance, preventing any one thrust from outrunning its logistics or tearing open gaps that German counterattacks might exploit. Where Collins focused on immediate momentum, Bradley had to manage the entire Western theater at once. The two men respected each other, but they worked at different altitudes. Collins lived in forward command posts and road-clogged crossroads, pushing divisions through collapsing defenses and seizing openings before they closed. Bradley sat atop a latticework of armies, juggling priorities that rarely appeared on frontline maps. Their disagreement was not theatrical. It unfolded in muted staff conferences, in map-covered trailers thick with cigarette smoke, in penciled notes scribbled beside arrows stretching eastward. Bradley urged synchronization and restraint in some sectors. Collins pressed for relentless exploitation before German lines could congeal again. Neither view was irrational. Each reflected the burden of the seat being occupied. By the end of August, those tensions hardened into operational adjustments. Boundaries shifted. Axes of advance were reassigned. 7th Corps was repositioned, while other formations inherited the primary thrust eastward. From Collins's vantage point, the war did not slow. Guns still thundered. Units still maneuvered. Objectives still demanded blood. But the symbolism of being moved off the very spear point his troops had carved was impossible to miss. Beyond the front, German officers were warning each other about his methods. Behind it, Allied planners were recalibrating his role inside a campaign that had grown too vast to allow unchecked acceleration anywhere. The contradiction defined the moment. Lawton Collins had built his career on competence rather than spectacle. Now, without seeking drama, he found himself suspended between two judgments that could not have been more different. To the enemy, he was becoming dangerous. To parts of his own command structure, he was a variable to be balanced inside a sprawling coalition offensive. The war was about to decide which assessment carried more weight. The shift in Collins's forward role did not mean the German army suddenly found relief. Even as 7th Corps adjusted to new sectors, the momentum it had unleashed kept rolling eastward across northern France. Allied columns surged toward the Seine, engineers flinging pontoon bridges across muddy currents while German rear guards detonated spans behind them and left wrecked vehicles blocking village streets. Collins toured crossing sites where troops worked waist-deep in cold water under intermittent shell fire, steel pontoons clanging into place while supply convoys stacked up for miles along cratered roads. His staff tracked reports of enemy formations unraveling during retreat. Panzer divisions that once counterattacked confidently were fragmenting, their fuel dumps torched, communications severed by airstrikes and artillery concentrations that seemed to fall with mechanical precision. Prisoners described headquarters cut off from subordinate units, orders arriving too late, columns abandoning tanks for lack of petrol. Those interrogations climbed quickly through army channels. So did Collins's name. It appeared in margins beside phrases like rapid penetration, heavy artillery employment, and tight armor, infantry coordination. British liaison officers remarked on the speed with which his corps exploited collapses. American Army commanders praised the clarity of his reporting and the discipline with which his units kept moving, despite logistical strain. To German staffs struggling to slow the advance along the approaches to the Meuse, 7th Corps felt less like a collection of divisions than a machine that refused to pause. That made what followed feel strangely unreal. Bradley's headquarters, buried under fuel shortages, traffic jams, and the strain of coordinating several armies racing across France, issued new operational directives in the neutral language of staff work. Boundary lines shifted, arrows on maps were redrawn. Corps were reassigned to new sectors with phrases that sounded mathematical rather than human. Collins was summoned to a conference trailer thick with cigarette smoke and paper maps. He listened while officers explained that the main eastward thrust would pass, for the moment, to other formations. 7th Corps would adjust its axis. Its immediate mission would change. There were no accusations, no criticism, no suggestion that he had failed. The words were calm, clinical, yet the meaning was unmistakable. The commander whose troops had torn open the German front was being moved off the most visible spearhead at the exact moment the race across France filled Allied headlines. No reporters waited outside. No communiqué explained the shift. To the public, nothing had happened at all. Inside the command system, Collins understood perfectly. He had been set aside, not punished, not dismissed, but quietly repositioned by a higher calculus that valued synchronization over individual momentum. The sting lay in how silently it occurred. There was no stage on which to protest even if he had wanted to. Professional soldiers obey orders, especially the disappointing ones. Collins returned to his headquarters and carried on, but his staff noticed the difference immediately. Planning meetings changed tone. The talk turned from pursuit to consolidation, from chasing a collapsing enemy to stabilizing lines for future operations. He showed no outward anger, but officers who had watched him drive his corps through Normandy could see it in the way he studied maps longer, in how questions lingered after briefings, in the intensity with which he pressed for precision. Being rotated off the spear point had not broken him. It had sharpened him. What Collins did not see were the other conversations happening far behind the lines. At Eisenhower's headquarters, the velocity of the Allied advance produced as much anxiety as celebration. German resistance was dissolving in some sectors while thickening in others. Supply systems were stretched to the limit. New river lines loomed ahead. Decisions about which commanders would carry the next phase of the war flowed constantly across chafe desks. Field reports kept arriving. So did evaluations of corps performance. Collins's name appeared more than once. His earlier reassignment did not erase the record 7th Corps had compiled in Normandy. Staff officers noted how quickly his formations reorganized, how well artillery and armor cooperated, how smoothly his headquarters handled rapid advances across shattered terrain. When planners debated who could be trusted with future river crossings and high-tempo exploitation, Collins was discussed again. The sidelining was not an ending. It was a pause. Collins filled that pause the only way he knew how. He rebuilt. Staff procedures tightened. Liaison officers were pushed closer to the front so information flowed faster. Artillery headquarters rehearsed fire plans measured in minutes rather than hours. Engineers drilled river crossings until pontoons could be assembled under simulated shellfire in darkness. Infantry and armored units practiced loading and redeploying on almost no notice. Command post exercises stretched late into the night. Collins demanded tempo without chaos, speed without sloppiness. Every rehearsal was preparation for the moment when higher headquarters would need a corps that could move through Germany's natural defensive barriers before the enemy recovered. When that moment arrived, 7th Corps was ready. As Allied armies approached the Rhine and prepared for the final assault into the industrial core of the Reich, Collins was given major responsibilities once again. Engineers threw bridges across freezing currents, while artillery hammered German batteries on the far bank. Once crossings succeeded, his division surged outward, sealing escape routes and driving into collapsing formations. Inside the Ruhr basin, entire German armies began to fold. Columns surrendered by the thousands. Prisoners stumbled westward in endless streams, many of them telling interrogators that the American corps in their sector advanced with terrifying precision. The same name that had circulated months earlier in German intelligence files surfaced again: Lawton Collins. Rapid penetrations, relentless pressure, heavy guns. This time, there was no question about where he stood in the offensive. His corps was back at the center of gravity, and it showed. The advance carried Collins into places that stripped away any illusion of abstraction. Liberated camps revealed skeletal survivors and rows of unburied dead. Cities lay pulverized, civilians moving through ruins while displaced families clogged the roads behind advancing columns. Collins walked through some of these scenes in silence, listening to medical officers describe starvation cases and to civil affairs teams struggle to organize food and shelter. The war had ceased to be lines on a map. It had become human wreckage. By the time Germany collapsed, the record of 7th Corps was impossible to ignore. Major rivers crossed. One of the largest encirclements of the Western Front completed. Deep penetrations into the Reich during the final weeks of fighting. Losses were heavy. the achievements were heavier. No official statement revisited the late summer decision to rotate Collins off the spearhead. Bradley never publicly reconsidered it. He did not need to. Post-war histories traced arrows across maps and listed commanders beside successful operations. Collins's name appeared again and again. His revenge was not theatrical. There were no speeches, no confrontations, no declarations of vindication. It arrived instead in surrender columns, in bridges thrown across rivers thought unbreakable, in operational studies that credited his corps with keeping the Allied advance alive when it mattered most. The quiet professional who had once been shifted aside ended the war with a reputation built entirely on results. Berlin had feared him first. History sealed the verdict. If this story hit you the way it should, tap the like button. Every click tells YouTube that serious, documentary-style World War II stories deserve to be shared. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next hidden turning point. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from and which commander or battle you want us to cover next.